Burt Lancaster truly hated Lee Marvin. For decades, people assumed it was about drinking, professionalism, or clashing egos. That's the version Hollywood liked because it was simple. But the real reason cuts much deeper. It wasn't about alcohol. It wasn't about missed call times. And it wasn't about two stars competing for control. It was about something far more uncomfortable, a question that men of a certain generation spent their entire lives avoiding. Are you the real thing? Or are you just performing? I was 23 years old when I saw it unfold. Christmas Eve, 1965. Death Valley, California. We were filming a Western called The Professionals, and the desert had finally cooled to a merciful 38 degrees. Most of the crew had retreated to write leaders home or fight over the one payphone that still worked. But two men stayed behind, two of the biggest stars in Hollywood. And by the end of that night, their professional relationship would be over forever. At the time, I was a camera assistant. My job was simple: load film magazines, stay invisible, keep my mouth shut. But that night, staying invisible wasn't possible, because what I witnessed wasn't a typical Hollywood feud. It was a collision between two definitions of masculinity that could not coexist. To understand why it exploded, you have to understand who these men really were beneath the movie star image. Burt Lancaster was the performance of strength. Born in East Harlem in 1913, he grew up poor enough to know that nothing was guaranteed. If you couldn't fight, you didn't survive. But Lancaster discovered something else early on. His body could do things other bodies couldn't. He could flip, tumble, and fly through the air like gravity was optional. Over time, he turned that gift into a system: discipline, precision, control. By the time he reached Hollywood, he wasn't just an actor. He was a structure he'd built stone by stone. By 1965, Lancaster was 52 years old and unstoppable. He was a producer, a businessman, a man who defied the studio system by creating his own production company. His physical regimen was legendary: 5 a.m. wake-ups, running in desert heat, calisthenics that exhausted men half his age. He didn't drink during production. He didn't smoke. He didn't improvise. He memorized his lines so thoroughly he could recite them backward. He arrived on set exactly on time. Not early, not late. Precision mattered. In an industry built on chaos and excess, Lancaster stood out. He was the monk at the casino, and like many men who build themselves through sheer will, he carried a quiet contempt for those who didn't. Then there was Lee Marvin. Lee Marvin was everything Lancaster wasn't. Born 11 years later, Marvin didn't build himself through discipline. He was forged by trauma. At 18, he enlisted in the Marines, not out of patriotism, but because he wanted to know what he was made of. He found out at the Battle of Saipan in 1944, one of the bloodiest campaigns of the Pacific War. He was shot by a sniper, the bullet tearing through his body and damaging his sciatic nerve. He spent over a year in naval hospitals. He walked with a limp for the rest of his life. The visible wound was nothing compared to the invisible ones. By 1965, Marvin had just won an Academy Award and become Hollywood's definition of dangerous authenticity. When he played tough men, audiences didn't see acting, they saw recognition. His drinking wasn't indulgence, it was survival. When you've watched 19-year-olds die screaming for their mothers, whiskey isn't recreation, it's medicine, self-prescribed, ineffective but necessary. On set, Marvin was unpredictable. He arrived late. He forgot choreography. He was often drunk. But when the camera rolled, something snapped into place. Chaos became presence, truth, and the crew split into camps: control versus chaos, performance versus authenticity. What nobody understood yet was that both camps were wrong. The trouble started early. Death Valley was brutal by design. Lancaster arrived with a truck full of gym equipment and built a portable workout station in his hotel room. Marvin arrived with suitcases, most of them clinking, At the first table read, Lancaster arrived early with a color-coded script. Marvin arrived late, script folded in his back pocket, clearly hungover. Yet when he read his lines, his naturalism made Lancaster's studied delivery feel almost theatrical. The breaking point came during a cliff sequence in Nevada. The scene should have taken 2 hours. It took 9. Marvin kept forgetting the physical choreography. From my vantage point above them, I watched Lancaster's expression shift. Not anger, something worse, the realization that discipline didn't guarantee truth. Then, during a lunch break weeks later, Marvin said it out loud, loud enough for Lancaster to hear. He called him a circus performer who learned his lines. Disciplined, sure, talented, yes, but real. No. Lancaster froze mid-pull-up, lowered himself slowly, walked away without a word. 10 days later, Christmas Eve arrived. The production tried to make it festive. Lights in the catering tent, turkey, Bing Crosby on a cassette player. By nightfall, most people had gone to their rooms. A few stayed behind, drinking real bourbon. Lee Marvin was there. Of course he was. Burt Lancaster was outside, exercising alone in the cold, doing push-ups at 10:30 on Christmas Eve. Then Marvin's voice carried across the desert. He mocked Lancaster's discipline, called it fear, fear of being ordinary, fear of stopping the performance. He talked about real warriors, about Saipan, about blood and death, about actors pretending at trauma for money. He accused Lancaster of playing men he'd never earned the right to portray. When Lancaster stepped into the tent, the room went silent. What followed wasn't shouting. It was something colder. Lancaster admitted he hadn't been to Saipan. He hadn't stormed beaches, but he told Marvin he'd built himself from nothing. That discipline beat chaos. That trauma wasn't an achievement. That Marvin had turned suffering into an excuse. Then he ended it, calmly, professionally. You will never work with me again. They finished the film without sharing another shot. The movie became a hit. Critics praised the tension. The two men never spoke again. For decades, that's where the story ended. Until years later, when I found Lancaster's military file by accident. He tried to enlist repeatedly during World War II. Each time he was rejected. Flat feet, old circus injuries, enough to disqualify him from combat. Suddenly everything made sense. Every push-up, every run, every ounce of control wasn't vanity. It was penance, a lifetime trying to prove himself worthy of a war he was never allowed to fight. And Marvin's drinking wasn't just trauma. It was the terror of knowing the worst thing that ever happened to him was also the thing that gave him unquestionable authenticity. Two men trapped by opposite fears, each hating the other for possessing what they could never have. The tragedy wasn't the hatred, it was that they were both right and both wrong, because authenticity isn't earned through suffering, and discipline isn't proof of worth. The moment you ask if you're real enough, you've already lost. Lancaster and Marvin never figured that out. You still can.